The Australian Grand Prix has not even started yet, and Formula One is already facing a shocking possibility. A car designed by Adrian Newey, one of the greatest engineers in the history of this sport, might not survive its very first race. Hours before lights out in Melbourne, a growing fear is spreading through the paddock. Not about speed, not about strategy, but about something far more dangerous. Violent vibrations inside the Aston Martin. Vibrations powerful enough to damage the hybrid system. Vibrations that already destroyed crucial components during testing. And here is the detail that makes this story even more serious. During winter testing, Aston Martin completed only 128 laps, one of the lowest totals on the entire grid. Fernando Alonso attempted a race simulation, and the car stopped after just 23 laps. That is not a small warning. That is a technical alarm. Now the team arrives in Australia with a completely revised car, designed by Adrian Newey himself. But inside the paddock, one question is echoing everywhere. Can this machine actually survive an entire race distance? Because if the vibration problem is still there, Melbourne could turn into a nightmare before the season even truly begins. And the most shocking part is this. Adrian Newey believes the car still has enormous potential. Which means what we are about to see in Australia might not just be a difficult debut. It could be the beginning of one of the most dramatic technical stories Formula One has seen in years. So stay with me, because the real situation inside Aston Martin is far more complex than anyone expected. What makes this situation even more unsettling is how quickly everything changed. Because just a few months ago, Aston Martin looked like one of the most ambitious projects in Formula One. A brand new factory. Massive investment from Lawrence Stroll. The arrival of Adrian Newey, the engineer behind multiple championship dynasties. And a full technical partnership with Honda for the new generation of power units. On paper, it sounded like the beginning of a new super team. But Formula One has a brutal habit of exposing problems very quickly. And the first cracks appeared long before the cars even reached Australia. They appeared during the winter. Quietly. Inside the garages of pre-season testing. At first, nothing looked dramatic. Every team struggles during testing. Small failures. Sensor issues. Software adjustments. These things happen every year. But what started happening with the AMR26 was different. Because the problems kept repeating. The car would go out, complete a few laps, and then return to the garage. Mechanics immediately surrounding the rear of the car. Panels removed. Engineers speaking quietly over headsets. And the longer the tests continued, the clearer it became that Aston Martin was not running normal programs. Other teams were simulating long race stints, running fuel loads, pushing tire degradation studies. But Aston Martin was stuck doing short runs, short bursts, constant inspections. And the data coming from those runs began pointing toward something unusual. Something hidden deep inside the architecture of the car. At first, engineers suspected a cooling imbalance. Then they suspected electrical instability in the hybrid system. But when the telemetry was analyzed more carefully, another pattern appeared. Certain vibration signatures were appearing again and again, always under similar conditions. Acceleration zones. Energy deployment phases. Moments when the hybrid system delivered maximum power. And that detail changed the entire investigation. Because in modern Formula One cars, vibrations are not just a comfort issue. They are a structural threat. The hybrid battery pack is extremely sensitive. The electrical systems operate under immense loads. And when those components begin to experience resonance through the chassis, failures can happen very quickly. This is why some of the most experienced engineers in the paddock immediately became concerned. Because vibration problems are among the hardest technical issues to eliminate. They are invisible. They move through the entire structure of the car. And sometimes the source is not even where the damage appears. It could be suspension geometry, gearbox mounting, power unit alignment, or even the aerodynamic loads compressing the chassis at high speed. And when a car is built with an extremely aggressive concept, those forces can become unpredictable. Which brings us back to Adrian Newey. Because Newey is famous for designing cars that push the limits of packaging. Extremely tight internal layouts. Minimal space. Components placed with millimeter precision. That philosophy creates incredible aerodynamic efficiency. But it also leaves very little margin for mechanical tolerance. If something vibrates more than expected, the entire system can feel it. And that is exactly the kind of scenario Aston Martin engineers have been investigating for weeks. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because despite all these concerns, several people inside the paddock believe the AMR26 might actually be hiding something remarkable. And the reason lies in the way the car looks. Multiple drivers and engineers have quietly said the same thing. The Aston Martin is different. Not just slightly different. Visually different in ways that suggest a completely alternative aerodynamic philosophy. One rival driver even described it as the most visually striking car on the grid. Which in Formula One usually means one thing. Someone has taken a very big risk. And sometimes, those risks either fail spectacularly, or change the entire competitive order. But before we get to that possibility, there is another piece of this puzzle that almost nobody is talking about. And it might explain why Aston Martin arrived in Australia knowing the first race could be extremely difficult. But before anyone jumps to the conclusion that Aston Martin is collapsing, there is another layer to this story that changes the entire perspective. Because Adrian Newey did not arrive at Aston Martin to build a safe car. He arrived to build a revolutionary one. And when Newey designs something revolutionary, the early phase is rarely smooth. In fact, if you look back at many of his most dominant cars, the pattern is surprisingly similar. Radical concept, strange shapes, unusual packaging, and at the beginning, confusion. Rivals do not understand it. Engineers inside the team struggle to unlock it. And sometimes reliability becomes the first obstacle. That is exactly why the AMR26 has attracted so much attention in the paddock. Because visually, it does not look like the rest of the grid. The nose design is unusual. The bodywork philosophy is aggressive. And the rear suspension architecture is far more complex than most cars on the grid. Several engineers from rival teams have quietly admitted something interesting. They do not fully understand what Newey is trying to achieve yet. And when that happens in Formula One, it usually means one of two things. Either the concept is flawed, or it is brilliant. But here is the critical detail. For a concept like this to work, every part of the car must function perfectly together. Aerodynamics, suspension, power unit, hybrid system, energy management. If just one of those elements behaves unpredictably, the entire structure begins to suffer. Which brings us back to the vibration problem. Because the most dangerous technical failures in Formula One rarely start with explosions or dramatic breakdowns. They begin quietly. Tiny oscillations. Small resonance frequencies. Forces that repeat thousands of times per lap. At first, nothing breaks. But inside the components, stress begins to accumulate. Bolts loosen. Electrical connectors fatigue. Battery modules absorb repeated shock loads. And eventually something critical fails. That is why Aston Martin engineers have spent weeks analyzing telemetry from the winter tests. Not just looking for performance. Looking for patterns. Looking for frequencies. Looking for the exact conditions where those vibrations begin to appear. And the frustrating part is that the issue seems to appear only under very specific circumstances. High acceleration. Maximum hybrid deployment. And certain aerodynamic load conditions. In other words, the exact situations that occur constantly during a race. That is what makes Melbourne such a big unknown. Because testing environments cannot fully reproduce the chaos of a real Grand Prix. Dirty air, traffic, changing tire temperatures, energy recovery cycles, full fuel loads. These conditions push the car into operating windows that simulations sometimes miss. And if the vibration issue still exists, the Australian Grand Prix could expose it very quickly. But here is the twist that makes the entire situation even more intriguing. Some analysts believe Aston Martin may have deliberately hidden parts of their real concept during testing, running incomplete aerodynamic configurations, avoiding aggressive setups, not because they wanted to deceive rivals, but because the car simply was not ready yet. Which raises an important question. What if the Aston Martin that appears on the grid in Melbourne is not the same car we saw during testing? Adrian Newey himself hinted at exactly that. He explained that the car arriving in Australia would be very different from the early shakedown version. And that the version racing at the end of the season will be different again. Constant evolution. Constant development. A moving target. That philosophy can be incredibly powerful, but it also creates risk at the beginning of the season. Because if the base car is not stable yet, every race becomes an experiment. And in a sport where a single mechanical failure can destroy an entire weekend, experimentation is dangerous. Which is why the atmosphere around the Aston Martin garage right now is so tense. The mechanics know the car has potential. The engineers know the concept could work. The drivers know the project is ambitious. But until the lights go out in Melbourne, nobody truly knows what this machine will do. Will it survive the full race distance? Or will the vibrations return and force Aston Martin into one of the most difficult race weekends of the entire season? And there is one final detail that makes this situation even more dramatic. Because if the AMR26 does manage to survive Australia, then the real story of Adrian Newey's Aston Martin project will only just be beginning. And this is where the story becomes even more uncomfortable for Aston Martin. Because if the car struggles in Australia, the pressure will not come only from the results. It will come from expectations. Massive expectations. The arrival of Adrian Newey was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era. The moment Aston Martin transformed from an ambitious midfield team into a true championship contender. Lawrence Stroll invested hundreds of millions into that vision. A brand new technology campus. State-of-the-art wind tunnel. Top engineers recruited from across the grid. And at the center of that entire project, Adrian Newey. The man responsible for some of the most dominant cars in Formula One history. Cars that rewrote aerodynamic philosophy. Cars that turned teams into dynasties. So naturally, when Newey joined Aston Martin, many fans expected something immediate. A fast car. A competitive start. A statement in the first race. But Formula One rarely works like that. Especially when the regulations change dramatically. Because the 2026 generation of cars is not just an evolution. It is a complete reset. New aerodynamic rules. New power unit architecture. A 50-50 split between combustion and electric energy. And much more complex energy deployment systems. That means every team is essentially building an entirely new machine from the ground up. And when you build something completely new, unexpected problems appear. Sometimes small, sometimes catastrophic. But Newey himself has always approached these moments differently. He does not chase short-term perfection. He chases long-term potential. Which explains why the AMR26 appears so radical compared to many of its rivals. The wide nose concept. The aggressive bodywork shaping. The complex rear suspension layout. These are not choices designed for quick gains. They are structural decisions. Foundations for future development. And if those foundations are correct, the performance ceiling of the car could be extremely high. But there is always a dangerous period between concept and mastery. A phase where the car is fast in theory, but unpredictable in reality. And Aston Martin may be living exactly in that phase right now. Because the lack of testing mileage has created another hidden problem. The drivers themselves are still learning the car. Fernando Alonso is one of the most experienced drivers in Formula One history. He has driven dozens of different cars across multiple generations. But even he cannot fully understand a machine without laps. Without long runs. Without pushing the limits over full race stints. And right now, Aston Martin simply has not had enough of that experience. Which means Melbourne will become something unusual. Not just the first race of the season, but the first true experiment for the AMR26. Every lap will reveal something new. Every sector will provide new telemetry. Engineers will be studying the vibration sensors constantly, monitoring structural loads, watching the hybrid system temperatures, checking battery stability.